All right, welcome, and thank you for joining us as we continue our COVID-19 Legal Issues Forum. Today's guest is Duff Milkie, class of 1991, Cedar Fair's Executive Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary. Cedar Fair is the parent company to many of the country's amusement parks. Some locations include California, Michigan, Missouri, Texas, North Carolina, Virginia, and Ohio. Cedar Fair also has a park location in Canada. As we have heard in previous forums, COVID-19 has changed and continues to change our world. As states are reopening their businesses, we also find ourselves in the midst of summer. Many of us have been eager to escape the confines of our homes where we've been holed up for months. People are looking for some sense of normalcy. This is the season for amusement parks and for fun. Yet the worldwide public health crisis continues, and those in the business of fun need to make adjustments for the health and safety of their workers and the public. My name is Heather Carnes, Assistant Dean for Career Services and Alumni Affairs here at the College of Law. As guests are joining us, I want to share a few notes about our virtual event today. Attendee names are not visible to other attendees. They are only visible to hosts and presenters. Therefore, you'll only see your name in the attendee list. For today's presentation, we request that you submit questions using the chat box, which I will be monitoring throughout the session. We will route questions to Dean Barros and Duff as we begin the latter portion. To access chat, click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. The chat panel will appear in the right bottom column. Additionally, if you would like to change the view on your screen, you can click in the upper right corner to expand or to reduce. With that, I would like to turn things over to our moderator for today's session, Dean of the College of Law, Ben Barros.
Thanks, Heather. Duff, thank you so much for joining us today. Good to see you again, albeit virtually. So we're mostly going to be talking about COVID-19 and about things that are going on right now, but we always start these discussions with a little bit of career history, because a lot of our viewers are current students and prospective students. So can you give us a little bit of a career recap about how you got to where you are today?
Okay, sure. And thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and go back to the alma mater, University of Toledo, which has given me a great foundation for where I am today. So, you know, I started out when I got out of law school. I went into private practice with a firm and was a litigation associate and did a variety of different areas of practice, including insurance defense and did a little bit of domestic work and a little bit of criminal work. You know, kind of that basic get involved approach. And as I went through that, what I realized is that I wanted to have more of an opportunity for litigation and to actually get in the courtroom. And so it's tough to get trials sometimes. The system kind of doesn't encourage that at a point. So I left private practice and I went to work for the city of Sandusky as the city prosecutor, with the idea that I would be the guy that if a case got tried in the criminal docket in the municipal court, I would be the person that would try the case and therefore get a lot more experience in litigation. What I didn't know is when I got there that my boss, the law director, would quickly move on, and then I found myself as the law director of the city of Sandusky, which then gave me the basic underpinnings that I rely on to this day, which was I had to build a legal department. I was representing a public facing board in the city commission. And then I was thrown into the fire, if you will, on the civil side and business side, and the related financing that went into all the development that was going on with the city, because the government is oftentimes a big participant in kind of fostering those transactions. And so I spent a few years doing that and learned a lot about that, and that really helped to accelerate my career and my level of expertise, just based on the sheer number of transactions. And then I went back into private practice and I started representing small and mid-sized businesses in a variety of different areas, including employment, real estate development law, and regulatory administrative kind of matters. And I did that for about 10 years. And along the way there, I made some contacts within Cedar Fair. And in 2008, Cedar Fair had, 2006, Cedar Fair bought Paramount Parks and doubled the size of the company. And so it became time to bring their legal services in-house. And I was fortunate enough to get that position. And, what I learned as I mentioned before, was all that prior experience with the government and representing small businesses and having a variety of different experiences across the spectrum of the legal world was a very good foundational piece to do that. I remember when I interviewed for the job, I interviewed with Tom Harvey, who was the general counsel at Goodyear. And during the interview, he described to me the role of general counsel as like the guy at the circus who spins the plates, and that you constantly have to go around and just keep those plates spinning. And that's always stuck with me as a very good descriptor of it. But I've enjoyed every second of it.
Good, thanks. And can you talk a little bit about Cedar Fair itself, the company, your parks?
Yeah, so Cedar, as was mentioned at the top, we have 13 parks. We're in 8 states in the United States, and we have a park in Canada as well. Many of our parks have water parks as well as hard parks. We entertain about 28 million people a year. We have a growing pass base as we continue to grow that loyal base of fans for our parks. And the states we operate in are North Carolina, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan. We just recently bought 2 parks in Texas, which was the first M&A transaction we've done in about 12 years. And then Missouri, two in California, and 2 in Ohio, and 1 in Virginia. And so the 2 parks in Ohio that are familiar to everyone are Kings Island and Cedar Point, where our corporate headquarters is in Sandusky, and we also have a satellite corporate headquarters in North Carolina. I'm located at the Sandusky headquarters.
Okay, great. I'm getting word that we're getting a little bit of an echo when we speak. Heather, can you just nod? Is there still an echo? Duff, I don't know if when I talk, if you could try muting your mic.
Okay.
Let's just give that a try, see if that's better. And you're going to be doing most of the talking, and I'll remind you to unmute if we need to. So before we get to COVID, one last thing. One thing you told me, I think last time we were together, is something about, I think all of you as executives have to ride all of the roller coasters or something like that. Can you remind me about that?
Yeah, I think I said that when we try out a roller coaster, what the guys that build the roller coaster say is they always have the dummies ride them first, and that would be all the executives would have to take the first ride on the roller coaster. But actually, part of that story is when I first started at Cedar Fair, we built a new roller coaster in Canada, and it was a 300-footer. And I learned the lesson that we all had to ride it because I was told that I had to get on the front cart and in the front seat and ride it. I wasn't a big enthusiast of roller coasters at the time, and the little lap bar across my thighs. I just kept saying on the way up, I'm at work, I'm at work, I'm at work, but it turned out to be a great ride.
Great, thanks. So let's talk about COVID. We'll go back in time a little bit, but let's just start with where you are right now. It's got to be an incredible challenge, being in Northwest Ohio. I'm naturally thinking about Cedar Point, but you're thinking about parks all over the place, including in Canada. Where are you right now? And also, I guess we should probably note, so Cedar Fair is publicly traded, I believe, and so you have to be careful about what you talk about and what you don't talk about. But kind of where are you with your plans as of right now?
Okay, yeah, great. And I will provide for you what I can provide for you that's publicly available. So where we're at right now is we have 5 parks open or will be open. So we have 2 parks in Texas, which are water parks. That are both open and operating right now. We have a park in Missouri, Worlds of Fun in Kansas City, that's open. Kings Island opened on July 2nd, and Cedar Point will open on July 9th. We're actually having family and friends day here today. All of those parks were open on a phased approach so that we could make sure that our protocols were working and that, you know, the plans that we had drawn up in the boardroom actually worked on the midway. And so we've done a phased approach. Texas opened, the Texas parks opened in mid-June. Missouri opened for the end of June, and then, as I mentioned, Kings Island and Cedar Point. And then we have a smattering of other parks that are close to being ready to be opened. But again, we're working constantly with the government and the state officials to determine, you know, when we would be allowed to open and when the conditions are safe for people to come into the park. And so that's where we're at right now. And as I said, one of the things that has helped us is we have the ability to limit the capacity in the parks, and we've utilized a reservation system when necessary in order to make sure that we stay within the capacity limitations as provided to us by the state government.
And so in this context, are you largely following the directives of state government? Is that your main driver on how a particular park is going to open, as opposed to your own internal judgment calls and policies? Or is there a combination of the two?
Yeah, there's a combination of the two. So we build our protocols, our operations group built our protocols based on interacting with our industry peers to understand what others that were similarly situated in the same business, how they were managing the COVID. IAPA is an international theme park association which has worldwide membership, and so they're a great resource because we can leverage not just the United States, but also, you know, across the pond and understand what they're doing there. So we borrow from that. We dealt with each state, and we looked at their regulations and what they wanted. We served on a lot of subcommittees and so forth, so we were actively participating in that. Of course, the CDC regulations, and then we brought in our own experts. We have an infectious disease medical expert that we run our policies through to make sure that they're effective from a medical perspective, as well as effective from the operational perspective. And then we brought in other experts to kind of look just at the logistics and our ability to be able to execute, because the first part is establishing the protocol, which is very important. We want to comply with everything. And then the second part, which is equally as important, is that those protocols can live and breathe in the real world and that they are enforceable with consistency, because that's really kind of the hallmark of what we're doing. So that's what we did. We took an approach of the greatest hits, if you will, and then we added our own standards. And one of the things we always say to the government when we talk to, you know, one of the things that we do is we're professional risk managers, as you might imagine. We put people on roller coasters that go 100 miles an hour. So safety is really in our DNA and really important. And thereby development of protocols, the training of those protocols. We bring in 50,000 seasonal employees every year, so we get very good at training people. About 30% of those are returners, but the rest of the people are new, so we have to be very good at orientation and training and bringing people up to standards. COVID falls right into that because we develop those protocols and we run through that same process. And so that has proven to be very, very valuable foundational core capabilities.
Great. So what are some of the highlights, if you can give them to us, about what your infectious disease people are telling you about COVID? And as far as your training of your employees, what are some of the things that you're really emphasizing as far as COVID safety goes?
Okay, so I mean, I think it's kind of the big four I look at as masks, you know, the utilization of masks and how best to manage that in our environment, the health screening, including temperature checking, social distancing, and then hygiene and sanitization. Those are the things that are really super emphasized. And then along with that is the communication, which we really tapped into our technology that we have in order to give the guests a lot of information as they come to the park, and our associates a lot of information through using our app system. to disseminate information, pre-arrival information for the guests, training information for the employees. With the employees, you know, the idea is consistency, right? You have to be very consistent with following those protocols, good modeling. And then one of the other things we talk about with is that we're all responsible for making sure that everyone's being a good customer, a good citizen. And there's an approach that you have to take with that to encourage people to follow the rules as they exist, but at the same time recognize that they are guests in the park, and you want to, you know, have that communication be a positive interaction. And so we work with that with our associates on a regular basis. And of course, their modeling and adherence to the protocols is one of the best signals they can send to our guests that it is important and that we're following the rules. And we want our guests to feel very comfortable when they come into our parks that we have thought about this and that we take it seriously. As we told Governor DeWine, we recognize that it isn't business as usual. This is a new way of doing business. And we emphasize that to our employees as well.
You mentioned capacity limitations a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about how your park capacity for next week or two would compare to same time last year?
Okay, so our capacity, our limitation is at 50% of max capacity, which in an amusement park, max capacity can be a very large number. We rarely, if ever, have had to close because we had too many people in there. But theoretical maximum capacity, we use 50% of that. And then, as I mentioned, we've eased into it. So if we look at it this time of year, we have some of our biggest Saturdays in July. And so there is, we won't get to that number, obviously, but for two reasons. One, 50% capacity wouldn't cover that number, but two, we're phasing in. And so we're going to wade into this water and not jump into it in order to make sure that, again, that our protocols are in place and they're working, we don't overwhelm the system. And so if you look at 50% capacity on just a normal run rate, a lot of our days we wouldn't exceed that, okay? And so we can accommodate, it's a big place. Cedar Point, for example, is over 350 acres, as well as Kings Island. And so there's a lot of space in our parks to spread people out. And that's one of the things that we had to do a good job of communicating to the governors of the states, is just understanding that sheer scale and how that works from a social distancing perspective, and how much opportunity we have to kind of spread people out, especially when we do limit capacity. And then we use our reservation system, as I said, to help control that. You log on, you reserve, and it gives you a time when you're supposed to show up. You can show up at the park at 11:30, at 12, at 12:30. That also helps with us processing people through the health screening and temperature check that are required before you come into the park. And so that's kind of how we're managing it. I think that, you know, we have the capacity at 50% capacity. We'll be able to manage quite a few people to be able to come through and have a good time and still have ample room for social distancing.
Great. And was one thing that helps you in this particular context that amusement parks are largely outdoors? And are there indoor parts of the park that you're having to do different things with for COVID mitigation?
Yeah, yes, we are very much taking advantage that we're in primarily an outdoor environment. We have closed down many of our indoor entertainment venues. We've closed down some of our rides that just wouldn't allow for the experience on the ride to match what we would need to do from a social distancing perspective. So we're primarily keeping people on the midways and keeping our large rides open where we can handle social distancing and so forth. But yeah, that's been a significant modification in terms of to just not open the indoor venues.
Okay, great. So let's take a step back. Just how it's funny because the past 3 months seem like they've lasted, I don't know for you, but it seems like they lasted a year or two for me and for a lot of people. Going back to the beginning of the year, when did this start? When did COVID start popping up on your radar? And can you tell us a little bit about how you were reacting to it as things developed?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we always talk about it in COVID years, which is a day feels like a year.
Right.
And, as we all know, I mean, it's a very dynamic situation in terms of what the CDC is saying and what the science is telling us and how people are reacting to it. And just, it is truly a dynamic situation. I would say it would be early March. I particularly remember the moment when I heard that the NBA had canceled their season or suspended their season. That was to me a harbinger of like, okay, we've gone into a new phase of this in terms of it started out like shut down for 2 or 3 weeks, and then we don't want to overwhelm the hospital, build up capacity, and we'll be fine. To when the NBA said, hey, we're going to suspend our season, that was the hallmark of a new kind of more serious overview of what COVID would mean. And so what that meant to our business is we had to step back and say, okay, we're a business that relies on gathering people in large numbers together to have fun. And at a time when the country is saying, don't gather together in large numbers, okay? And so we then had to consider what was the impact on our business in the short term. We had to close. We had a few parks open, 3 or 4 parks open that we closed based on what I said, that it was no longer a good idea or safe to operate at that time, given the governmental regulations that were in place. So we did that. We took care of that immediately. Then we had to start going in. How long will this last, and what are the long-term impacts? And of course, like most businesses, we're forecasting revenue to come in our doors in order to operate the business. And so we then had to take into account how long would this close and what would that mean to our liquidity position. And so what we did is we stepped back and we looked at that and we took care of that. We did a financing transaction. We did a secured bond, and we borrowed money to shore up the liquidity so that we would not have that uncertainty hanging over our head. And that also would allow us to be more patient and deliberate about how we got reopened. And so we took care of that first. And then simultaneously with that, our operators were working on okay, what do the reopening protocols look like? And we were monitoring what was going on, and we were starting our conversations with our industry partners and the states to determine what is it that we needed to do. What did safe reopening look like from all perspectives? And we worked on those protocols. We set up a numerous internal committees, and we looked at everything that we've talked about already: the sanitation, the masks, the distancing, how we set up our restaurants. One thing is, every one of our parks is like a city. We have restaurants, we have retail shops, we have merchandise, we have police function, fire function, our midways, our sidewalks, if you will. And so we have all that. So we had to go through all those. We were touched on each one of those. When restaurants had to move tables out, we would have to do that too. So we went through our whole operation and we looked at all of that stuff. And then once we had that where we felt like we had a good package that was well informed from all those sources, then we also went to the government and we started the conversation with them about reopening and how we fit into the overarching plan, how we could help by providing them some of our insights from being professional operators of large open public spaces. And we did that in every state. And our GMs and our regional vice presidents, ours is a type of business that we're kind of like American pie, a little bit, a slice of American pie. So we're involved in our communities all the time. And so we leverage that community involvement and those connections, both at the local level would be, from mayors up to our state representatives, up to the governor's office itself. And we did that in all of our states in order to make sure that we were plugged in and being part of the discussion and the evolution of what everybody was going through. And then ultimately in some of the states we were able to achieve reopening. But we kind of did it in a very deliberate fashion and did it on a first things first basis.
Mm-hmm. Was there any litigation that you all were involved in about any of these issues, about reopening and about regulation and that kind of thing?
Yeah, we ended up with the state of Ohio. We filed a lawsuit in Warren County, and so the backstory of that is we had a lot of really good conversations with the governor and the lieutenant governor and our state representatives, and made a lot of progress on what reopening looked like. And we looked at other businesses that were being reopened and the similarities in terms of their overlay of what they were offering and how they were going about doing it. Our focus always being on, can we safely open the business? We answer that question in the affirmative. Yes, we can safely open the business. We walk through with the governor and the lieutenant governor many of the things that we've already talked about today, and in addition, answered other questions that they had. So we had a really positive relationship with the governor, and the government, the Ohio government. The issue that came up at the end, as you're making that final decision, is that in the COVID world and how fast-paced it was and how many decisions were required to be made by the government officials, they're under a tremendous, they're in the eye of the storm. There wasn't a lot of room for due process in that environment. And so as we move down, the value of due process in terms of the ultimately getting people to make a final decision was never more apparent than at that time. It's, your reaction when you're a little bit like, what should we do, is you can do nothing. Due process kind of drives that along and says, hey, we got to put our cards on the table, kind of a thing. And so for more than any other reason, the reason we would file the lawsuit is that it did borrow from the judicial system that overlay of due process, which then allowed us to have that structure in place. And ultimately, we resolved it with the governor, literally, a day or two after we filed the lawsuit. And we're able to, move forward with the protocols. The governor asked us to interact and make sure that the local health departments were signed off, and so we did that, and we were able to open. And since then, we've dismissed the lawsuit. But I think that the primary takeaway from that, it wasn't acrimonious in any way. It was really about due process and equal protection and all those issues that came up. And I just think it was a final piece of a puzzle that had been put together over months and months of cooperative conversation with the governor.
Great, thanks. So I want to swing back to something you said. So one of the things I've been thinking about, a lot of people, both personally and professionally, is masks and enforcement of mask rules, right? At the University of Toledo, we are requiring masks of everybody who comes back, students, faculty, everybody. And one thing you said earlier is that, it's interesting because in your business, there are a lot of circumstances in which you have to enforce rules, and very important rules, safety-related rules all the time, with people who are your customers. And so you were talking earlier about that relationship and how you train your employees to, even when they're enforcing their rules, to try to have it as positive an interaction as possible under the circumstances. And I was just wondering whether there's anything you could tell us about that, and maybe things that we can learn from people in our companies in your line of work about how to enforce rules in a fairly positive, rigorous but positive manner.
Yeah, there is a magic there, and it's a constantly evolving art form to be able to do that. And so, I think with masks, I think what we've learned over the last several weeks is your policy has to be reflective of its ultimate goal, right? We want people to wear masks because that's going to retard the spread of the disease. And it's it's part and parcel also of social distancing and the health screen. They all kind of work together. And so that's what we've kind of found. And so what we try to do is say, with our mask policy, we have relax zones. We understand that people are going to want to pull that mask off when it's set 95 degrees. And so what we do is we try to anticipate the need to do that and steer people into those areas when they can pull the mask down and social distance. So we're still getting at the underlying goal of the policy, which is to retard the possibility of the spread of the disease. So that's one thing that we've done. And then that also, like what we always say is, the biggest thing with your associates and the people that have to enforce the rules is they have to have a good understanding of what the purpose of the rule is, right? Because if they're just parroting a rule without really understanding the why, they're not nimble in the interaction that you're going to have with other people, and therefore it's going to come off as more rude than necessary. And so, you know, Matt Wimett was our former CEO, and he always used to say, when you don't tell people why, they go to the negative right away, right? If a ride's down, the associate, the person comes up and says, hey, what's going on with the ride? And if we haven't told them why, they say, it's always broken. As opposed to saying, hey, this part broke and it'll be back up and running in 20 minutes or something. The same thing applies with masks, right? So the person struggling with the mask to say, hey, listen, we have relaxation zones, okay? So you could go in this area if you need to take a break. The other thing that we've done is we've looked at those relaxation zones and said, what are the characteristics of those zones? They're areas that lend themselves to so ample social distancing, so that the interaction that the mask is trying to prevent isn't as present. And so we've tried to broaden the relaxation zones enough that they're actually relief. And then that gives us the overlay to where, like, if you're in a retail shop or you're in, buying food or something like that, where you're indoors, now we have the basis to say, hey, you need to have your mask on here, or you're in line to go on a ride, you need to have your mask on here. And so it tries to be a reasonable process that the guest understands and can invest in. And then, as I said, the modeling of the employees, and then an upbeat attitude towards if you look at our website, it says we're all in this together. I think that kind of epitomizes the underlying perspective that we take, that this is a group thing where we all have the same goal, so let's work together to do it. So that's kind of the way I would answer that.
Right. Good communication, treating people with respect, being very clear on the why, not just the what you're doing.
100%. The why is really, really important.
Yeah, great. So we alluded earlier to the fact that Cedar Fair is publicly traded. I'm former securities litigator, so I'm just kind of curious about this. So one of the things a lot of our listeners may not know is that publicly traded entities need to disclose all sorts of things and disclose risks that they see. So I'm curious, what kind of COVID disclosures did you guys engage in the past couple of months?
So that was another work stream I should have mentioned after COVID back in March. Yeah. So we had to file our Q1 or our year end, and so we went back and we scrubbed that, and we went back. We had a lot of work to do with our auditors to look at that, and then our SEC counsel. And a lot of that was, your forward look. As I mentioned before, there's the risk of COVID, like that, you may not be able to get open again, or that when people come, the risk of exposure, how does that look, and what are the downstream impacts? And primarily that was it. What is the longer range impact on the business? It proved to be a very difficult and arduous task. Lots of credit to our accounting folks for working through that, because at the time that we're doing this, and the SEC gave us an extension of time, I think, to not just us, but I mean the publicly traded world, an extension of time, because there was so much uncertainty out in the marketplace that it didn't lend itself to the typical predictability that you utilize in order to create your risk factors. And so it was the art form of not being overly pessimistic or overly conservative, and to describe what might happen. So I'll give you an example of that when we did our financing, we had to have the real bear and bull case, the proverbial bear and bull case of what could happen. And so there was lots of different perspectives. My God, we're not going to get open again for 2 years. The economy is completely shut down. To, well, this is more of a temporary dislocation. And what we did is we looked at both of those scenarios and then developed risk factors around those that were intended to reasonably approximate what that viewpoint would engender from a risk perspective. But it was one of the harder things that we had to do, and it created some very unusual issues that we had not wrestled with in a long time. And as I mentioned at the outset, one of the primary ones is, we go into the year planning our normal revenue cycle that we report out, and now there's no revenue. And when there might, because the states were not in the mode of, hey, we need to start getting things reopened. We were very much in we're shut down mode. And so it was really an exercise in not overreacting, but by the same token, as you kind of suggested in your comments, we have an obligation to provide to our unit holders what it looks like. And that had a lot of the financing transaction had a tremendous impact on how we were able to report those risk factors, because the added liquidity on the balance sheet ameliorated many of the near-term issues.
Great, thanks. I'm going to ask one more question myself, then turn it over to Heather to ask questions from the audience. I invite people who are listening to ask questions on the chat, and Heather will ask them. So you were talking about, and boy, it really hit home thinking about roller coasters, about your company being your professional risk managers, right? Managing risk is something that you do. Can you talk, it's not really a COVID question, it's a more general question, about the process of risk management, and maybe a little bit from a lawyer's lens, because this is something that I like our students to think about. To think about risk mitigation, about how part of a lawyer's job is to advise on risk, not necessarily say don't take the risk, but to advise on how to take the risk well. So can you talk a little bit about risk management?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that is a very prominent, as I mentioned, prominent thing in our world. I remember when I first started, one of the first contracts I did was they were going to have Robbie Knievel jump over 12 Coke trucks. And the question was, how do we keep everybody safe? And I was like, this is one of the best jobs you could ever have. You talk about risk management. And so, that story just brings with it what you just said is, you in this business, you have to evaluate the risk, and you have to then understand how that risk resides within the business that you're doing, right? For example, we do things like that. We put people on a roller coaster at 90 miles an hour. If I was a really conservative risk manager, I would say, well, don't do that. That's dangerous. But obviously, that is our business. And so what we've done here that from the lawyer's perspective, we've set up a lot of good apparatuses. I work very closely with our internal audit team in terms of managing the risk by making sure the protocols are being followed, by cataloging the manufacturer's recommendation for riders and what the rules and regulations are for people getting on those coasters. But make sure, I always say, when we go back and we have an after incident, what they're going to look at is what did we know before it happened and how did we react to it? And so that's what I spend a lot of time looking at and working on. And so the director of safety reports to me for purposes of kind of managing that risk. And what she constantly does is catalog all these different things that are happening out in the field And then we have a safety committee, and we go through that. We also have an enterprise risk committee that has all the different disciplines in it, which I think that is an invaluable tool from a risk manager's perspective, because you have a heat map. And what it also allows you to do is to raise new issues as they come along. And I think the thing that you do as an attorney is you raise awareness to people to spot risk, right? The attorney's stock and trade is issue spotting, right? You don't have to have all the answers, but you better be able to spot the issues. And I always remind myself of that when we're in a meeting and we start talking about things. It's like being a referee in a game. You can't watch the game because you're there to enforce the rules. So you watch the game with the rules in mind. That's how I describe risk management for myself, is watching the game with the rules in mind. And then building the apparatus around you where the consciousness of the enterprise is constantly evaluating risk. I have an easier task here because that is in our DNA, is safety is one of our cornerstones, and so we constantly watch and evaluate it. But since I've been here, we have coordinated the legal department and the audit function and finance function very much so have developed that enterprise risk management side of the business that as I said, is very, very helpful. And then I also work, on the insurance side of the business. And then we do the claims management. As you might imagine, we get a lot of litigation claims and we manage that down. And what we do with that is we resolve the case in the court system, but then the more important part about that is the after action, the so what. So this happened, so what's the impact on what's going on out in the field, and do we need to make changes? Why did this happen? Is there a pattern? We always watch out, is there a pattern on a particular ride? Because we have lots of rides that are the same in each park. Is there a particular way we're doing things that we need to change? And to me, the management and litigation down, we know how to do that. We can do that. It's the after action plan that is vitally important from a risk management perspective. So I spend a lot of time doing that as well.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Let me turn it over to you for a few minutes.
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay? Yep. Okay. Duff,
Yep.
This question relates to just the large parks, the vast park system that you have. You were talking about predictability and managing risk, and you're in a situation where you have parks in different states where there are outbreaks and surges happening as we speak. So could you talk a little bit about what your communication is with each of those teams on the ground and what that back and forth looks like between them and you as a corporate entity?
Yeah, sure. So we have corporate vice presidents that regional vice presidents that have charge of those parks, and they interact on a regular basis with the GMs of those parks. And so that's part of our monitoring apparatus. And then we have internal auditors that we send into those parks to make sure that we're following the rules. And in this particular case, we've done more of that. We also have, back to the risk management, what I did was I took I pretended that if we were to get sued, what would be the questions that would be asked? What would be the documents that they would want? And then what we did is we deployed that out and we asked for that information to come back to us. So we did the after action before the action, and that was another way to make sure that we're following the rules. And then on a day-to-day basis, as I said, we have the internal auditors, and the regional vice president will be there on site as we get started. So that's how we make sure that we're living up to what we said we were going to do. And then as far as the spikes and the up and down, as I mentioned earlier, our GMs and those regionals have excellent relationships. We do have a government relations division as well that reports to me, and we help to coordinate all that. But we start at the local level and we work our way up, and we make sure that we stay in touch. We want to be a cooperative, good corporate citizen that's reflective of what's happening in each one of those markets. And our biggest thing is, we have to feel that we can safely open the park, right? And it's safe for our guests to come and enjoy it. If we don't meet that metric, we won't open. And so as circumstances change on the ground, we're constantly evaluating and monitoring that in connection with public health officials and public officials and industry partners to make sure that we have the best available information.
Okay, great, thank you. Along those lines, can you, wait a second, we just got another question in. So will Cedar Fair require guests to sign a liability waiver in case they contract COVID-19 while in the park or sometime shortly after? And if so, would it be enforceable?
So we look, when we first started down this path, of course, we looked at that. Enforceability is an issue, given the nature of when that waiver would be signed and just given the sheer volume of those signatures and the overlay of what COVID involves. Okay, and so we decided that waivers were not practical and that we were pretty concerned about their enforceability. And so instead of doing that, we decided to go with an assumption of the risk, buttressed by safe practices. So when you come to our park, you'll see signs that say, you're assuming the risk when you come in here. For COVID-19, it's hard to control. There's infectious disease, and you could be exposed to that. And then we have, we're going to wear masks, and we're going to do health screening. We're going to do social distancing. We do temperature screening. We also set expectations on that. A fever is one symptom, but people can be asymptomatic, and we point that out to people. So it's really, we're going with a full disclosure with processes and protocols that retard the spread of the disease and are equal to best practices, and then a warning so that people know what they're getting into. So we really pound with the information, but we have not done the waiver.
Okay. Could you comment on the 1851 Center lawsuit against the state of Ohio, and did Cedar Fair support that suit?
So I think there were 1851 did represent us in the Warren County suit. I think that might be referencing also the suit in Lake County on the gyms there to get open. So, what I would say to that, as I mentioned before, I think sometimes there's three branches of government, right? The executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And so sometimes it is necessary to utilize the judicial branch of government in order to have responsiveness or to do problem solving, frankly. I mean, as I mentioned, we filed a lawsuit not out of acrimony or anything like that. We filed it more as a procedural step in a process that was intended to give us the opportunity to safely open our parks. And part of it, underneath that is the equal protection. We saw others and felt that, what really drives it is, can you safely open the park? Can you, your business, do you have the right protocols in place? Can you observe social distancing? Will people wear masks? All of those things that have become the hallmark of a safe environment for in which people to reside and being able to enjoy themselves. And so that was really the marker that we were looking at. But as I said before, it was really more of a procedural step. I do support the fact that using the judicial branch should not be something that we shy away from. In fact, it's what our whole system is built on, that when we have disputes and we cannot reach our conclusion on our own, we thankfully have a judicial system that allows for proof of facts to come out and help as a very effective problem solving and resolution apparatus, because it has a conclusion at the end of it, and so then people can evaluate how they think that's going to come out and act accordingly. So I think it's valuable. It's valuable to be able to do that, and it's the best way to resolve differences.
Okay, thank you. Going back to assuming risk, there's been a lot of talk about the pandemic catching people by surprise. Did Cedar Fair or Cedar Point, did any of the parks have a pandemic plan?
No, we did not have a specific pandemic plan. The earlier question on SEC risk factors, I wish I could say we had the foresight to put pandemic in there, but we didn't. And so what we did have is, as you might imagine, we have somewhat similar type of things. We have crisis management plan. It's part of our ERM. I think what would be a little bit analogous to it is like if you had food poisoning or something like that, right? Where you're people in your park and then they trace it back. And so we look at those issues all the time to how would we react to that and what do we best do not to prevent that from happening. So we borrowed from some of our existing protocols. For example, cleanliness of our park is always very important to us. And so we went back and we looked at what are the principles that we're already operating on and how does COVID impact those? And then we beefed them up in order to address something that was newly introduced. But I have to say we did not have a pandemic plan. But because we're professional, risk managers and we deal with lots of people all the time, we did have lots of first cousins of outbreak type things and crisis management that really helped us to have a little bit of a running start.
Unfortunately, we all have one now, right? What does a relaxation space at the park look like? Are there, and how many are they? Where do they exist around the park in Cedar Point specifically?
So they're in a variety of different places in the park. The app will help tell you at each park where they're at. And I would, as opposed to saying where they are, I'll describe their characteristics. It would be areas of the park where you would be able to easily observe 6-foot distancing from others and have a little bit of a more private place with the people that you've come and arrived at the park with, so that you can take down your mask without the risk of interacting with other folks that don't have masks on. And they're interspersed throughout the park in a variety of locations that lend themselves to it. I would say right now we're evolving where they are to make sure that we're providing enough relief. We're looking at the midways and saying when we're going from one place to the other, is there where we have very wide midways and a limited capacity of people, there's lots of space out there. And so does that help people traveling from one place to other where you're exerting yourself a little bit? Is that a place where you can have a little relaxation? Those are the types of things we're looking at. But the hallmark of a relaxation zone is it's signed to say, hey, you can pull your mask off here and rest a little bit, and there's going to be plenty of space there so that you're not impacting others and they're not impacting you.
Okay. Along those lines, we have a question about how full roller coasters will be. But before you answer that, I'm thinking about, as I've walked through the park, how long some lines are for these coasters and where you would potentially create a 6-foot distance in any one of those coaster spaces. So can you just talk about the coasters specifically?
Yeah, so we just had this experience at Kings Island. We opened a new roller coaster there, Orion, and so everybody wanted to go on it, and we had quite a long line when you have the 6-foot distance into it. And so what we did is we started giving people times to come back to that ride, so that you're waiting in line, but you're not waiting in line. And so that's one of the things that we utilize in order to limit the amount of people in the line. But on the other ones, we have, like at Cedar Point, for example, we have 18 roller coasters. And so over time, when we didn't have that many, we had a lot of queue line because there were fewer coasters, so longer lines at those coasters. Well, as we've gotten more coasters, we've spread the crowd out a little bit more, which has given us the opportunity to kind of go back and use that corral line and then use every other one so that we can spread people out and they're not 6 feet. So there's that. But the lines are longer. The wait time is not longer, but the lines are longer. And we use the time to return as a way to mitigate that. And then on the rides, we'll block out seats so that people aren't next to each other. And there are some rides where we just simply don't run them because we can't observe the appropriate social distancing, just given the nature and dynamics of the ride.
Okay. So in the front car, one person, typically?
Say that again?
Said in the front car, there's going to be just one person?
Well, it depends. If it's like Valraven maybe has 4 across, so you might have 1 on each end.
Got it. Okay. Ben?
So we're getting close to the top of the hour. So maybe let me ask one more question, and then we'll let you get on with your day. So your business is largely seasonal, right? And so are you in a place, although it occurs to me that in some parts of the country it might not be, to what degree are you in a space where you're thinking, okay, let's, excuse me, get past the next 3 months and then we'll have a long break to see how things play out? Or how much are you going to be having to deal with this constantly for the next year?
So I would say where we are as a business now is that we have seasonally cyclical revenues, but we're not necessarily seasonal. And this is what I mean by that. So Knott's Berry Farm is our only park that's open all year, and that's in Southern California. And the other parks do close, but we've added in 6 parks now a winter fest. And so that keeps us open till the end of the year. And we have across our parks the Halloween weekends or Halloween haunt at all of our parks, which takes our season to the end of October in any event. And I would tell you that in that time is when we have our largest days, believe it or not, are in October. And so we're already out to that. There's a few parks that don't have. Michigan is just a water park, so it doesn't have that. But most of the parks are open through the end of October, and then we have 6 parks that would be open till the end of the year. And so that's why I say, the lion's share of our money is still made in that seasonal period, but we are open longer. And so that's some context to say. To answer your question directly, so we have to think about what this means for those events as we go into the year, because there's lots of theming and other kind of ramp up that you have to do for that. And then how does that look and feel in a COVID environment? Are how does that event present itself? So we're busy doing that right now. We're starting that planning for our second season. And then when that's done, you're right. One of the reasons we wanted to get open and make sure that we got into this is we could learn. And then when we go dark, whether that, this year is earlier than the end of the year or not, and some parks will go dark. Cedar Point is, closed on November 1st in any year. Then we would spend that time digesting what we had learned and kind of dialing it in so that when we get to 2021, we really have protocols that have been educated and tried out in the laboratory of the parks. And so we see how they really work so that we can get that much better at them. And we do that every year. Like, we plan the party all winter, and then we throw the party in the summer and in the fall, and in some places into the early winter, and then we do it again. So that planning period may be longer this year, and it may be necessary for it to be a little bit longer.
Great. Well, thanks so much. This was a really great discussion. Thanks so much for joining us today. Good luck, and take good care of yourself.
All right. Well, thank you. And thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it. Go Rockets.
Okay.
Thanks, Duff. Thanks, Ben.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
I hope that went okay.
Hold on 1 second here. I think it did. I think it did.
Right,
I have a follow-up question that showed up. I'm going to send that to you over email.
Okay. Sounds good.
Right.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. It was fun.
Today.
Thank you.
Bye.
See ya. Bye.